So over the past decade, deepening political divides have given way to rising moral polarization, the tendency to judge out-party members more harshly than one's own. Political leaders now routinely morally degrade opponents as evil, dangerous, or garbage, and most partisans view those on the other side as more closed-minded, dishonest, and immoral than other Americans. And polarized judgments like these are often resistant to change because they are deeply entrenched in partisan identity. For instance, a national survey conducted before the 2024 election asked people whether they would accept $1,000 to change their social media profile to a picture of themselves wearing a t-shirt supporting the opposing candidate. This would be enough money to cover the newest iPhone, 2 Nintendo Switch 2s, or 6 days at the new Universal Park in Orlando, which if you have a chance to go, I would highly recommend. But almost half of people rejected the offer, showing that not even a substantial cash incentive is enough to outweigh party loyalty, even in a hypothetical scenario. However, although party group membership can be profoundly inflexible, it is only one of many social groups that an individual belongs to. For instance, I am not only a Democrat, but also a PhD student in social psychology in Boston, a rock climber, a Christian, a cat mom, that's Felix, he's one, and the daughter of a Mexican immigrant. And the relationships and perceived overlap between a person's multiple social groups shapes how they think about themselves and others. So understanding political polarization and ways to reduce it requires understanding the connections between a person's political group and their other social groups. For instance, someone who identifies as both a Democrat and a Christian may vary in the extent to which they see these two groups as overlapping. And these differences are captured by a framework called social identity complexity, which describes the extent to which someone sees their social in-groups as less overlapping. For instance, a Christian Democrat who thinks that many Christians are also Democrats and many Democrats are also Christians perceives these two groups as having large overlap and we would be considered low in social identity complexity. Hi, Diego. Whereas someone who thinks that not many Democrats are Christian and not many Christians are Democrats perceives these two groups as having little overlap and is considered high in social identity complexity. So this concept captures subjective awareness rather than the objective overlap between groups in society, and individuals may vary in the extent to which they see the same two groups as overlapping. So I illustrated this by using Christian Democrats as an example of both low and high SIC, but due to the stereotypical association between Republicans and Christians, we might expect that most Christian Democrats have high social identity complexity. Other examples of intersectional identities that might be seen as complex include groups like Jewish people of Arab descent, female CEOs, Muslim feminists, LGBT Republicans, trans military members, and the most iconic complex identity of all, Troy Bolton from High School Musical, who was tragically torn between his loyalty to the basketball team and the theater club. And for the last example, I'd like to invite you all to think about your own social groups and which of them might be complex. For instance, all of you are academics, you live in New York City. Try to think of another social group you belong to that your colleagues might be surprised to hear about. Which of your social groups are largely independent of one another, not having many of the same people in them? When I started grad school, I was really curious about the experiences of people who hold complex counter-stereotypical identities, and I focused my research on examining two questions. What are the psychological effects of holding complex identities, and how might holding these identities mitigate intergroup bias in moral judgment and other domains? And these questions form the basis of the work that I'll be talking about today. So in the paper, we consider numerous pathways through which social identity complexity might impact moral judgment, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on two. So first, we propose that social identity complexity may mitigate biases in moral judgment by increasing awareness of the diversity that exists within groups. For instance, consider someone low in social identity complexity. This person is more likely to see their social in-party as consisting of overlapping in-groups. So a Republican Christian Southerner might think that nearly all Republicans are also Christian Southerners, and therefore view the out party as similarly comprised of overlapping outgroups. So all Democrats, for instance, who are atheists and live in the North. On the contrary, someone high in social identity complexity may view their social groups as less overlapping. So they might only think that some Republicans are also Christian Southerners, while others are atheists or live in places not in the South. And by extension, be more likely to view the out party as heterogeneous. So since only some Christian Southerners are Republicans, some Democrats must also belong to those categories. And people who are high in social identity complexity may themselves be more likely to hold counter-stereotypical identities like being an atheist Republican or a Christian Democrat, making the salience of this diversity more clear. And these perceptions are important because they impact whether people view out-party members as individuals or simply as members of outgroups. So people low in social identity complexity might be more likely to view all outgroup members as essentially one and the same, and therefore highly prototypical of the outgroup and judge them mainly based on their membership in that group. Whereas people high in social identity complexity, acknowledging the differences and variation within the out party, will be more likely or less likely to view out party members as highly prototypical. Yeah.
So over here, is it like a subjective sort of rating of like, I think that all these qualities of mine overlap?
Like the overlap in group membership. So yeah, so subjectively you think
that these are all similar.
For low social identity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm saying it's like a person could have, you could have two participants with the same three groups.
Exactly.
One participant thinks that those three things are overlapping and one participant doesn't.
Exactly, yeah.
Is this inclusion of the other in the self, right? This is our Arian.
So this is like about.
But it's specifically about identity.
Like group, this will become clearer when I go over the measure of social identity complexity.
It makes me think of a relationships measure, so I'm just thinking about that. IOS.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with that measure, yeah. So this is less about like trait level or value level similarity, perceived similarities between groups, and more about like, are the same people who are Democrat also these similar groups, or are they in different groups more associated with the outgroup?
I see, okay.
So based on this logic, we hypothesized that people high in social identity complexity would perceive outgroup transgressors as less prototypical of the outgroup. And the second way we theorize that social identity complexity may impact moral judgments is by reducing the desire to defend one's in-group when threatened. So this is based on prior work that shows that people high in social identity complexity are less susceptible to things like stereotype threat. So this work suggests that for people low in social identity complexity who see their social groups as highly overlapping, when they're confronted with a threat to one of those identities, it's more likely to result in a threat to their whole self-concept. And as a result, they may be motivated to judge out-party members harshly to maintain positive in-group distinctiveness and reduce this threat. Whereas for someone high in social identity complexity, who sees their outgroups or their in-groups as less overlapping, when they're confronted with a threat to one of those identities, they can more easily shift which identity they're focusing on for deriving a sense of belonging and self-esteem. And so the idea here is that people high in social identity complexity are less rigidly attached to any one of their identities for defining themselves. They have greater self-concept flexibility, and each identity is less important for defining who they are. And so based on this logic, we hypothesize that individuals with greater social identity complexity would have lower in-party attachment. So we tested this model across a series of studies. I'll talk about the methods and results all together, but I just wanted to highlight. So for the last 3 studies, they were all pre-registered. We tested hypotheses across multiple studies. Most of the samples were half Democrat and half Republican, except for the first sample, which also included independents, but we exclude those from the current analysis. Okay, so in the current studies, participants first completed a measure of social identity complexity. Then they read a series of out-party transgressions. After reading each transgression, they completed a moral judgment measure and also rated the typicality of the transgressors. And then at the end of the study, we measured identity strength. So first, to assess social identity complexity, we chose to assess it between 4 of participants' identities in line with prior work. So we pre-selected the domains of 3 of those identities. So we chose political party, religion, and race. And then for the 4th identity, we allowed participants to choose another important identity of theirs. The most frequently reported identities included things like sexuality, parenthood, occupation, gender, etc. And we chose this combination of identities, one, to optimize the balance between identities that are important, for instance, have shown to be important in research on social sorting. There's increasing evidence of increasing alignment between people's party identity and their religion and their race. But we acknowledge that those identities might not be important for everyone, so we allowed participants to report a 4th identity. So to measure SIC, participants were asked to report how many members of their political group are also members of each of their other social groups. They did this on an 11-point scale from none are to all are. This is Ruckus and Brewer's 2002 measure of social identity complexity. So, for instance, a Christian Democrat would have been asked how many Democrats are also Christian and how many Christians are also Democrat. So low responses on this scale would reflect viewing these groups as having little overlap, that not many Democrats are also Christian, consistent with high social identity complexity. And high responses on this scale would reflect seeing these groups as having a lot of overlap, consistent with low social identity complexity. And they would make the same judgment for the overlap between their party identity and their race, as well as their party identity and that 4th identity that they could choose. So we reverse scored all items so that higher scores reflected higher social identity complexity, and then we averaged them to create a mean composite score of social identity complexity. Next, participants read 6 moral transgressions committed by out-party members. So for instance, one scenario read, imagine that the following has occurred in your town in response to an upcoming talk scheduled to be delivered at a local college by a controversial speaker. Out-party members of the community launch a protest on the campus. The protest breaks out into a riot, resulting in significant damages estimated around $100,000. Other scenarios included damaging an out-party protest sign, stealing from charity, biased grading of students' work in the classroom, abusing political power, and deliberately publishing misinformation that supports their party. So we chose scenarios that both reflected a variety of moral transgressions, as well as ones in which it made sense to include the agent's political affiliation to reduce demand effects. Next, participants completed a 3-part moral judgment rating. So they rated how morally wrong the protesters' actions are, or the transgressors in whatever scenario, how morally bad are these transgressors, and how much punishment, if any, should they receive for their actions. And these were averaged to create a score that represented how negatively people judge the transgressors to be. And so we analyzed the results using multi-level models, accounting for variation both within participants as well as within the transgressions. And then finally, we measured the perceived prototypicality of the transgressors by asking participants how typical are these actors compared to other members of their political party. So if they were Republican protesters, how typical are they compared to other Republicans? And then at the end of the study, we measured identity strength using the Heavy et al. Measure, which include items like how important is being a Democrat or Republican to you, and to what extent do you think of yourself as Democrat or Republican? So first we'll take a look at the average moral judgment ratings of the transgressors. So on the y-axis here is negative moral judgment. So higher scores reflect judging the transgressors more harshly. And I'll show mean scores for the sample that I'm talking about now, as well as for a separate sample that received transgressions committed by the in-party. So we see evidence of inter-party bias here, where people were significantly more likely to judge the out-party more harshly than the in-party for the same transgressions. Next, we took a look at how social identity complexity may impact these judgments. So first, we looked at people who are especially low in social identity complexity, and we see that they were especially likely to judge out-party members more harshly. And then we looked at people especially high in social identity complexity and found that they were less likely to judge out-party members more harshly. And these overall trends were consistent with these patterns, such that greater social identity complexity was associated with judging out-party members less harshly, but not significantly associated with judgments of in-party members. And for this reason, we focused on trying to unpack the relationship between social identity complexity and judgments of out-party members. And this overall interaction is consistent with other evidence that polarization is often driven by out-party hate more than in-party love. So first we looked at testing our hypothesis that people higher in social identity complexity would judge out-party members as less typical, as well as the impact of perceived typicality on moral judgments. So in line with our hypotheses, we found that people higher in social identity complexity who view their political party as less overlapping with their other social groups perceive out-party members as less typical members of their group. So this suggests that they were thinking about them more as individuals and less simply as members of the out-party. And in turn, these judgments help to mitigate the effects of outgroup derogation on moral judgment, as seeing out-party members as more prototypical was associated with judging them more harshly. So this is evidence that people higher in social identity complexity are more likely to individuate targets in their moral judgments. So next, we tested whether individuals with higher social identity complexity would have lower in-party attachment. So as we expected, we found that people higher in social identity complexity expressed less rigid attachment to their partisan identities. And this in turn was associated with mitigating outgroup derogation and moral bias and moral judgments, as greater identity strength, as it's been demonstrated in a lot of prior work, was associated with judging out-party members more harshly. If you're wondering whether this is just because people high in social identity complexity are less extreme or more moderate, we also test the effect of partisan extremity on moral judgment. So we find that there is a significant correlation between SIC and extremity. So people high in social identity complexity are less politically extreme in their views, but this extremity had no significant effect on moral judgment. And we also see the effects hold controlling for partisan ideology. Okay, so we found evidence that people with higher social identity complexity have lower in-party attachment. So next we sought to test whether these pathways were supported in a mediation model. Just flagging, obviously this mediation is correlational, so not good causal evidence, take of it what you will. The editors at JESP asked me to do this, so here we are. We did a mediation using the mediation package in R, and we found significant indirect effects for both mediators, and we found that the direct effect did not remain significant, supporting full mediation. So high-level takeaways, we find evidence across studies that social identity complexity is associated with reduced bias against out-party members in moral judgment. And this was explained through two distinct routes. So first, viewing your political party as less overlapping with your other social groups promotes individuation. People see out-party transgressors as less typical of their group, rely less on out-party category membership for informing their moral judgments of those people, hinging their judgments more on specific characteristics of the individual, like their actions or perceived motivations. Second, it fosters self-concept flexibility, weakening the importance of partisan identity for defining the self, and reducing defensive motivations to boost the status of the in-party by derogating against the out-party. Why this matters? So it shifts our focus from in understanding intergroup bias from the salience of one particular identity to trying to understand the relationships and perceived relationships among multiple identities. It identifies key pathways through which social identity complexity influences moral judgment, and also highlights social identity complexity as a potential target for interventions to address things like moral hypocrisy and polarization. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Oh, great talk, thanks. One question that I have is in terms of thinking about possible directions for kind of causally looking at the effects of social identity complexity. Do you have any thoughts of how you might do some kind of like reflection prompt to like think about your identity complexity, or either some like assign people to groups and like manipulate complexity between those? Do you have any thoughts on like how you might causally examine the effects of social identity complexity on moral judgments and other outcomes?
Yeah. So there's been a few studies that have attempted to causally manipulate SIC. I'm not super, I don't buy them a lot, but so one of them, the Grosky et al. Paper that does the stereotype threat work, manipulates it using identity maps. So they ask people in the low SIC condition to fill in identity bubbles. There's fewer of them. And then for the high SIC condition, they give them way more bubbles. But I think that's really tapping into like identity numeracy, which is like another thread of work. It's like how many groups you're a part of, not specifically like how overlapping you think those groups are. Other work has used reflection prompts by asking people to reflect on like tensions between their groups and things like that. But again, not really, in my opinion, priming the important underlying factors like the diversity that you think the group has. In exploratory work, I've tried to manipulate SIC using like counter stereotypical exemplars, like here's an like look at this Christian Democrat or look at this gay Republican, but without tailoring to the participant specific identities, those effects are weak. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of seeing how we can manipulate SIC to establish some of these causal effects.
Yeah, I also feel like it's probably not just about in the moment, the salience of like complexity. It's also like live this over a period of time that like, shapes how you interact with the news and other people, and that shapes your moral judgment. So I think that this work is like a really good like step in the right direction towards looking at these things. So yeah, I didn't mean to like be like, oh, you have to do.
No, it's I wanted to. It's it's also like difficult to manipulate perceptions like these. But this reminds me, so a lot of times people ask about, okay, these are like societal level perceptions. What about people's personal perceptions of like the overlap between these groups? So on that, I've done some interesting work on Christian Democrats specifically in like field work with churches in Boston. Like being a Christian Democrat in Boston is very different than being a Christian Democrat in my home state of Florida, where all of the churches, including mine that I go to in Boston, are very progressive. It's very explicitly like this is a Democrat space. Where like that wouldn't be the case usually in a place like Florida. And we find that those local norms are actually an important moderator of these effects, where if you're in an environment where your complex identity is highly supported or normative, it reduces the opportunity to, for instance, appreciate the diversity of groups or have contact with outgroup members, which you might be more likely to do in a situation where you don't have like an insular community where your complex identity is the norm. Yeah, so there's like an important relationship between people's local personal networks and like on a societal level.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think it was very interesting, and this concept of social identity complexity also makes me think about a lot of things. One question is, what exactly do you think is kind of driving this effect? Is it, for example, that there are contradictions between the different identities and forces you to think a little bit more? It gives you imagination, like a bit of perspective taking, like, oh, you know, I can see both sides, and therefore I can imagine other sides that I can't see right now. Or like, you know, how does it work? Right? Is it the meaning making process of having those
Yeah.
different things?
Yeah, so that's like another mechanism that we look at in the paper. So also mentioned like in other work, I found that social identity complexity is positively correlated with things like active open-mindedness. And in the paper, we specifically look at conflict avoidance in the context of groups. How uneasy do you feel when there's perceived tension between your social groups, and people high in social identity complexity are much less avoidant of that kind of conflict, which I think it like, because I often think of the importance of social identity complexity of like navigating conflicting group norms or pressures, like for a Christian Democrat, your Democrat friends might want you to do X, Y, Z, your Christian friends might want you to do things differently, and that might be especially the case in a place like Florida versus here. And so how do they navigate these tensions, building up like a tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, and that then helps reduce some of the cognitive social biases in terms of like intergroup judgments and attitudes and things.
So if you already have to resolve kind of these conflicts internally, you might also
Right.
be better at resolving conflicts externally.
Exactly, yeah.
At some point.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Or even being comfortable existing in a space where the conflicts might not be fully resolved,
Right,
but like
just
being,
in discomfort and
right,
without trying to avoid it.
right.
Whereas if you only have a very simple identity, maybe you see the one black and white, it's very simple. Your reality is very simple, so it's
Yeah.
very hard to imagine how you
Yeah,
different.
which I think opens up a really interesting developmental question too. Like, is it people that are more open to this like conflict and tolerance that are more likely to choose complex identities or be more capable of maintaining them over time? Or is it like a skill you develop by holding? Because some identities aren't chosen, they're obligatory.
Yeah, and sometimes you might see, because of social pressure, that you're trying to suppress some identities.
Right.
Yeah, historically, you know, for example, you know, you want to integrate into a new culture, and if your identity is seen negatively, then you're not going to talk about where you're from. You're just going to be, and so it's interesting. Therefore, you're trying to reduce the kind of complexity in this.
Right, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, great work, Chris. Have you sent this to Marilyn Brewer? I know she would love that.
Yeah, I actually got to meet her at
Okay.
a conference last summer.
Awesome, yeah,
Yeah.
she's one of my heroes. So have you ever thought about the opposite? So this is all correlational data. Have you thought about the opposite pattern? That if you're constantly exposed to like moral transgressions of outgroups, that starts to like reduce, because part of the way we think about morality is we think about it in black or white.
Mhm.
And a big part of polarization, that we have a paper arguing this with some bunch of political scientists, is that it's like seeing the outgroup as evil is kind of like the thing that's used, talk about outgroup animosity is the key driver of polarization now, and that's a big part of it. Do you think that like constantly being exposed to that is the thing that might reduce your identity complexity?
Mm.
And then when you're exposed to new ambiguous things, you start to filter it through that like narrow lens.
That's
And
really-
then part of it is, I think, like we study social media, and over time, there's been much more moralized language on social media, and that's how people talk. And that's one of the drivers of morality on social media is like using moralized language and sharing content that like fosters outgroup animosity.
Yeah, really interesting question. So part of the findings that I didn't get to talk about today looks at out-party warmth and in-party warmth as well,
Yeah.
and how that relates to social identity complexity. So we thought, based on a lot of prior work on things like racial ethnic outgroups and SIC, which shows that higher SIC is consistently associated with more like out people who are in your racial outgroup, greater desire to affiliate with them, warmer attitudes, that SIC would be associated with warmer attitudes also towards political out party members. But we actually see the opposite effect for both the out party and the in party, where SIC is associated with less negative or less positive attitudes toward both parties, and as well as like less.
Wait, so the more social identity complexity you have, the more warm you feel to different ethnic groups, but the less warm you feel to all partisans.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So it sort of suggests like another explanation is like partisan disdain or like
Yeah.
disillusionment with tribalism and things
Yeah,
like that. Like
interesting.
people high social identity complexity are just like done with how toxic everyone is.
Yeah, because political discourse is very much us versus them, and if you're somebody who embraces complexity, you're just like turned off by that.
Right.
Interesting.
Exactly.
So interesting. Is that published?
Yeah, it's in
Oh, is that
paper.
that's part of this paper?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I'll have to check that out. Any other questions?
Nice work. I was thinking about work from a colleague of mine. Have you seen work from Ariana Brown or? by chance? Okay, she was based in Europe, but she's now a faculty at OSU, but she has a paper looking at how when there's like a threat to your moral image, people might highlight some disadvantaged identity that they hold instead of the dominant, group majority advantage identity that they hold. So the same kind of idea of holding multiple identities and like, in this case, kind of bringing up a disadvantaged identity to help you like buffer. And so I was thinking about kind of underlying mechanisms here, and if you felt like, maybe this goes to Remy's question, but if you felt like the underlying mechanism here was about like the self-image and these kind of like protective measures, right? So in your case, it's judgments of outgroup members or it's ingroup bias. And it's like, I'm wondering if this is all just this kind of shared mechanism of like, I don't want to feel bad about myself. And so that's like driving, how much I harshly judge other groups that either share, that I think share or don't share my identities. Like that, if you feel like that's this kind of like the main thing, or it's about conflict with other things.
I definitely think that could relate to like the identity strength component of like when your group looks bad, you look bad too. So people high social complexity are less attached to their group, so they probably feel that effect less.
Yeah.
And as far as like the effect of SIC on self-perception, so in other work, I find that people high social complexity view themselves as much less typical than other people. And actually in this work, another mechanism we looked at was how similar people feel towards the out party. So we expected that because they see more overlap between the in party and the out party, they view themselves as more similar to the out party. But another unexpected finding, we actually found the opposite, where people high in social complexity felt less similar to both out party and in party members, which could be because they just see themselves like atypical members of society generally, so they see themselves as less similar to everyone. But yeah, they sort of view themselves as like an outlier in society, which I think has interesting implications for reducing some of the like group-based motivations for a lot of cognition.
Yeah, it could be about like need for distinctiveness or optimal distinctiveness, or kind of this balance of like, I want to fit in, but I want to be distinct, and also like self-image maintenance of like, if my identity feels threatened, then I'm doing things to mitigate that, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's cool.
Or it could be something like, it's its own form of identity. It's like a cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm a cosmopolitan person who likes thinking about being around other people who are like diverse and interesting and
Right.
not easy to put in a box.
Right. Yeah. Especially.
Because I could see that, like, cosmopolitan identity is like something Anthony Pia, who's like one of our philosophers here, talks about.
Yeah.
Sort of related to that. So in the work I do on Christian Democrats, I look at like identity structure and inclusiveness. So this is also in the Ruckus and Brewer original paper. They propose 4 different structures. So you could be a Christian Democrat that only thinks of other people who are both Christian and Democrat as in-group members. Or you could be someone that thinks of all Christians and all Democrats as ingroup members, regardless of if they hold both identities. But for someone who only thinks of, like, who sort of integrates being a Christian Democrat as like its own social group, distinct from Democrats, non-Christian Democrats or non-Democrat Christians, that might influence that might actually work against some of these positive factors. In that work, I don't find a consistent correlation between social identity complexity and structure, contrary to what they propose. But it's still sort of an open question as far as like, if you conceive of your in-group as just the intersection of your identities, does it sort of buffer against some of these effects? Yeah.
So would you think like people who have like low social complexity see more of like the parts of their life as like in group, and then people with high complexity see more outgroups?
Like have more outgroups or?
Yes, like would that be too like having more low social complexity in a way?
That's an interesting question. So, one thing, so the work on social identity complexity theorizes that like if you live in like a more diverse community, then you're more likely to have complex identities. Because you're more aware of like the heterogeneity like within groups. I suspect that people high in social identity complexity might actually have fewer outgroups, or like be less likely to conceive of groups as having like rigid boundaries and be less like essentialized. Because like, for instance, like a Christian liberal, they might view themselves like more similar to, maybe that's a bad example because we actually didn't find that. But someone who holds a complex identity might feel more similar to the out party and might be less likely to categorize them as like outgroup members because of like shared group overlap.
The last question.
I have two-ish questions. One is a theoretical question. So when you talked about the prototypes of like that would create prototypical party members, is that the prototype for each category? So if you're a Democrat, atheist, is the prototype of that you're creating for each group the same, or is it like these identities together and the prototype of that combined identity that we're creating?
Yeah, really good question. So broadly, I think political group membership has become so central to the way that we categorize people as in or outside of our groups. So I think there's a lot of weight applied to political group membership. So which is why we focus on party as like the central identity. I think that people have a lot stronger conception of like what a typical out party and in party member is compared to someone like a typical racial out group member, because of things like social sorting and polarization. Yeah, so and we did do another version of this study where we looked at religious outgroups, specifically between Christians and Jewish people. However, we ended up putting it supplementary because we found black sheep effect for moral judgment, where people are actually judging out the religious in-group more harshly than the religious out-group. The effects of social identity complexity were the same. They judged religious out-group members less harshly, but since they were already judged less harshly, it kind of like exacerbated the bias in a way. So it's kind of messy and we didn't include it. But yeah, so I think the effects of social identity complexity are consistent regardless of which group you're anchoring on. But I think perhaps strongest for identities like party, which are so divisive today.
And then I guess the methodological question. So when you were talking about the scenarios that you gave the individuals, in each scenario, the transgressor had their own identity, like they were a protester or they were an academic transgressor. Like, how do you prevent someone from seeing that identity? Because like, I see a protester as someone who identifies more with like a Democrat, like. How do you like disentangle the idea that they're overlapping that identity with whatever identities that they're already part of and judging them as that identity rather than the outgroup identity that you're talking about?
Yeah, I haven't really considered that before. That's a really interesting point. I mean, by including a variety of transgressions, we hope to like mitigate against like specific case by case effects. We find, of course, variation between transgressions, but the effects of social identity complexity are strongest in the cases where the intergroup bias is the strongest. So like regardless of the condition specifics, if bias is stronger, the effect of social identity complexity and mitigating that bias is also stronger. But yeah, that's an interesting question. As far as like by party differences, so we didn't find an interaction between SIC and the participant's political party in any study. We do see main effects of party on SIC where Democrats have higher social identity complexity than Republicans on average. But still among Republicans who have higher SIC, they show less bias.